Well, hello, everyone. This is John Byrne with Poets and Quants. Welcome to our special webinar. We're calling this a fresh approach to crafting college lists and attacking common app essays. And we have with us today a special guest, Rob Franklin, who's a mentor at Admissionado, a leading admissions consulting firm. Rob has a really fascinating background. He's been done a lot of different things, actually. Graduate of Stanford in poli-sci and government. That was my major. Went on to become a Bain consultant. Just finished up an MFA. That's a master's in fine arts, right? In creative writing, fiction, actually, at NYU. And you're a mentor at Admissionado, and you've been an SAT tutor as well. So you must have really broken the SAT test, right?
Yeah, I guess I did pretty well on it. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, Rob, most parents start in terms of college school selection with, do I dare say it, the rankings. Is that a good place to start, or are they getting off on the wrong foot?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So I definitely speak to a lot of parents who take one of two approaches. So one is, looking very closely at these kind of ranking lists, whether it's US News or one of the others that you can find. There are dozens and dozens on the internet, and having a sort of almost toxic rigidity in the way that they're kind of internalizing these rankings. Which, as we know, are liable to change year to year. It's not like a very solid bedrock on which to base a foundation. And then you kind of have, on the other hand, parents who sort of react to that first category of parents and basically want to, say that ranking lists are irrelevant and kind of in an effort to be a little bit more supportive, sort of throw that out as a guide. And I think both of those approaches are slightly misguided in the sense that, those lists are reflective of perception of these different institutions, as well as like the actual experience of going to one of these institutions. But we like to talk about at Admissionado more of this question of like vertical leap. So essentially looking at the individual student and seeing kind of how high they can jump, what's like the highest sort of tier of school they can get to. So we actually take an approach which we call the Echelon approach, rather than looking kind of strictly at these rankings.
Give me a little more detail about that approach.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I would say it comes into play in a couple different ways. So in school selection and kind of crafting the initial list, so as I mentioned, echelons 1 through 5 is kind of how the framework currently works. And within these echelons are schools that are kind of apples to apples in terms of both resources and perception. So schools in like echelon 1 would be schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, a couple others, where, I mean, obviously there are many differences culturally among those schools. But first of all, I mean, I gathered I kind of collated a bunch of the publicly available data of those admit profiles. And for the most part, on paper, the admits are not that dissimilar in terms of kind of their stats. And then in terms of sort of perception, if you tell somebody that you chose Princeton over Yale, they're probably not going to be shocked. And so grouping these schools into these different echelons, 1 through 5, is useful because you can take a student's existing profile, say they're a junior or a rising senior, and look at their kind of hard stats on paper compared to the publicly available data at this different kind of swath of institutions, and determine where they're fitting most currently. So say that's an echelon 2 school. That's great. So then you determine their targets should be these echelon 2 schools. That's kind of what's in their range. Then you would want to select a few from the Echelon 3 category, where you're fairly confident they're going to be admitted. And then really as many from the kind of category above whatever echelon they're targeting, that they would like to apply to, given like the lower kind of chance of admission. And the idea with all of that, sorry.
Reach, safe, and
precisely.
New, sort of hopeful kind of categories in a way, right?
Precisely. And so, I mean, the idea with that is basically like, then the student, let's say if they're admitted to one kind of Echelon 1 school, all of their Echelon 2s and all of their Echelon 3s, then the argument, at least from the kind of consulting side, the Admissionado side, would be that they should be picking the Echelon 1 school that they were admitted to, that they should be picking kind of the highest regarded school to which they were admitted. And then questions of fit kind of only come into play once you're comparing, again, kind of apples to apples within the same sort of tier. So these questions of, do I want to be in a suburban or rural environment? Do I want to be on the East or West Coast? These things that I think a lot of parents kind of overly prioritize and initially putting together the strategy list come into play kind of on the back end after you've heard back from the schools.
Right. And I'm imagining that a scholarship award could play a very big role in one's decision over deciding which institution to go to.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, do you look at a person's measurements, from use that word, or metrics, in relationship to what the school's reported averages are? Because of course, averages are just that, right? There are many people above and many people below. And you know, in terms of how do you fit people into these different categories that you have?
Sure. So from a quantitative perspective, you know, it's not a perfect science. I would say like many students would be kind of above the median 50 percentile student, which is usually what these schools publicly report. So they'll basically put out a report that's like, our median student, our 50th percentile student had this SAT score, this GPA, this class rank, etc. And as you mentioned, half of the students are above that, half of the students are below that. But directionally, it's kind of a useful place to see where they're kind of aiming. Right. And so then if I'm looking at a student's profile, you know, maybe they're above the median rank for like an Echelon 3 school on class rank and GPA, but below on their test scores, their standardized test scores. Then right. The kind of obvious advice becomes, okay, we need to be focusing on test scores and kind of improving that so that you're hitting or above that benchmark, which is starting to then make you look kind of more competitive for an Echelon 2 school.
Yeah, it makes total sense to me. Why does it feel, the whole process feels so cutthroat?
Yeah. Why? Is that the question?
Yeah, and how do you take some of that pressure away?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think the first thing is like, you know, there is a degree to which, like, you know, most of these schools, there are so many great institutions, first of all. And so I think this sort of over obsession or kind of very intense preoccupation with getting into a top 20, top 30, top 50 school isn't that productive, where, you know, it's as I've said, like those rankings, you know, it's not a kind of perfect methodology that go into those in the first place. Anyway, so I think first of all, kind of recognizing that there's a vast swath of schools where you could end up having a great education and a great experience. And then I also think, yeah, like this point again about kind of vertical jump and like how setting it up as an opportunity to kind of like challenge yourself and see how far you can kind of take this thing. So if you're like, okay, I actually think I'm kind of like on the cusp between like these two different kind of categories of schools, letting that be a reason to kind of motivate yourself, but not beat yourself up if it doesn't work out as you hoped. Yeah, that's kind of the advice I would give.
Now, on standardized tests, this is sort of an interesting issue, and it's become more so since the pandemic occurred. There are many schools that are now test optional. What do you advise a candidate? When do they take the test? When don't they take the test? What kind of disadvantage are you placed at? Even if you apply to a test optional school and you decide not to take the test, are they
Yeah.
going to have a more heavy reliance on your grades and your transcript and what kind of courses you took and it actually can backfire on you?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I would say that in general, so once you've kind of determined what your target schools are, you have an idea of what the sort of median SAT score or ACT, if you're taking that, is. I would advise, I mean, most students, and unless they have a really compelling reason to just never take it, I would advise they take it once because you never know. Like some people just test really well. And if you have a score that's kind of well above the median for this type of school you're targeting, then it's, you know, it's only kind of helping to tell the story that you would thrive at that institution.
Right.
So in general, my advice would be basically like if you're kind of above that 50th percentile, then you probably should submit it. But let's say you're right at that point or slightly below it, and you're deciding if you need to invest, you know, 10 hours a week and, you know, potentially some money in like tutoring or kind of, yeah, investing a lot of time and effort in studying to take it again. I would say, yeah, it comes down to kind of where the rest of your academic profile is. So if you're like a stellar student with really strong GPA and like, especially if your school is also offering class rank, then perhaps you wouldn't need the standardized test score to kind of like reify what is already kind of evident from the rest of your academics. If you feel like your GPA and other kind of academic stats aren't adequately capturing kind of your ability as a student, then standardized tests become a really great way to kind of balance out that profile. I would also say students with special situations, like if they were homeschooled, for instance, and so they're not in like a kind of peer cohort. It's good then to have the kind of standardized test score on their profile, just because again, like adcoms can look at that and be like, okay, this is apples to apples. You know, I know that the parents weren't just flubbing their grades in homeschool, but they could definitely thrive on this campus and kind of keep up with the rigor of the work.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. And I'm imagining that if you have a GPA that's below 4.0 and you're applying to one of the Echelon 1 schools, and you don't submit a test score, I think there's probably a presumption that you can't score well. Am I wrong?
You know, I mean, they would never admit that.
Of course not.
My guess is probably that that's true. Like, I think that, yeah, especially now that you know things are relatively open, and I think more and more students probably are starting to submit again compared to 2 years ago. Yeah, I do think that you should kind of think critically about what it suggests if you're not sending in a score. That said, I mean, if a student has already taken it a few times and is not scoring how they want to, and it really feels like it's going to have to become basically a part-time job for them to kind of raise their score 100 points, and might come at the expense of some of their really stellar extracurriculars or their grades, I would say that's probably not a great use of your time, and that you should invest in those other areas. But yeah, you should kind of give yourself a real shot and see see kind of how you're scoring on those.
Now, Rob, are the other parts of an application as important or even more important in some cases than the raw scores you have represented by a GPA or a standardized test? For example, your extracurricular activities and what leadership or not you may show in them, or what kinds of things you're involved in and what that says about your interests and passions, or how well you craft an essay and tell a compelling story about yourself. Can those things weigh actually more than a standardized test or a GPA, or it's really hard to tell?
I would almost say that it's kind of like, my impression is that those stats are sort of like the baseline where, most schools kind of have a band for, their kind of admissions band of what they're sort of expecting to see from anybody that they're admitting.
Right.
That frankly, I mean, a lot of students who will not be admitted are also in that band. So there are plenty of students who have a 4.0 and a really stellar SAT score who aren't going to be admitted to XYZ school. So it's almost kind of like those stats like clear a threshold, and then all of those other factors kind of really come into play. And so I do think that they're massively important. So crafting a great essay and telling just kind of a cohesive story about your sort of your fitness for future success, like kind of what sort of person you are, what your passions and interests are, that you're a kind of intellectually vibrant person. Those are definitely things that you're going to kind of want to focus on shining through the essays.
So you got to have that base. Like if you're a cook,
Yeah.
I don't know if you're a cook or not, but you
I'm
want
a
to
huge
have,
cook.
okay, your onion, your celery, your carrots, and your garlic with your olive oil in the pot first. And that's a necessary ingredient to a really good meal. And then you put in your meat and your other vegetables or your rice, whatever, but you got to have the base at least. And that has to be helpful to you probably, so you don't get canceled out, I imagine.
Yeah. And I think it's, there are exceptions where like a student is below the band, but has like an absolutely exceptional story or background. But those are so rare that it's like, don't don't bet on being the exception. And so I would say in general, yeah, it's like those bands that they're providing are the kind of baseline, and then all of those other factors are kind of how you distinguish yourself from the other people who are kind of meeting that threshold.
And when it comes to essays, I understand that Admissionado has a methodology called Spark that helps position someone strategically in the race to get into a good school. Give us a sense of what that is and what we can learn about it.
Yeah, I mean, so Spark is really just kind of a framework for speaking about some of the kind of personal traits that a lot of admissions committees are looking for. So it stands for, let me make sure I don't get this wrong. So S is for seizes, meaning kind of seizes, let's see, okay. seizes the day, takes advantages of kind of opportunities to advocate for themselves and for others. A lot of people who have kind of really stellar leadership scores are kind of strong in the seizes category. P is for pursues. So pursues challenges that would often scare others away. So this is the kind of student who is actively excited by something that is sort of intimidating to others, loves a challenge, etc. A is for asks. And so that reflects open the classroom and learning for the sake of learning rather than just getting the grade. R is for risks. So taking calculated risks towards a goal, which often, involves breaking the mold, thinking outside of the box, and yeah, otherwise kind of taking a more circuitous path toward whatever it is they're trying to accomplish. And then C is the ability to be creative and kind of crafty in creating, basically getting past obstacles and creating chances or opportunities where others see none. So say there's not a club for the thing that you want to do at your high school. The kind of create student would say, okay, well, the obvious answer is for me to then create that and create that opportunity to kind of pursue that interest rather than be defeated by the fact that there's an obstacle there. And
it's kind of a framework to decide what you write about, right?
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think students can kind of assess. I think there are a few ways that you could kind of use this to get toward an essay topic. I would say that ideally your essay, whatever you end up writing, is kind of checking off a couple of these different boxes and is illustrating a couple of these different traits. So one way could be to go through, look at these different categories and kind of write down a couple of essay options. And yes, see which one is kind of feels like it spans a few of these different traits. So if you got fascinated in some social justice issue through a class and you did a lot of kind of outside investigation of that, and then you sort of took a risk in doing some community organizing around that issue, despite the fact that you knew that you might not get that much administration support, that is kind of clearly illustrating asks, creates risks, and so it starts to look like a really compelling essay.
Now, you've worked with a lot of candidates, I'm assuming, and I wonder what kind of essay topics they've chosen to give others a clue about the kinds of topics that might prove one of the points that are made in this acronym that you have, this methodology. I know we have a daughter who wrote a college essay about deciding to drive a manual stick car instead of an automatic.
That's a cool essay.
Right? And well, she did get into Yale. So that maybe that.
Well, I mean, I think that,
but that was sort of an unusual and interesting essay, right? Yeah, but I'm sure you've had candidates who've written really interesting, fascinating essays as well.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, so that kind of is a nice segue into we do have these sort of essay archetypes that we talk about. So, I mean, I would say the bulk of essays that I read fall into a few different archetypes. So the first would be the kind of like personal growth, the personal growth essay. So basically providing a picture of kind of who you were before some sort of inciting event. And then, event happens, something changes. You were forced to then grow, to adapt to that change. And then you wrap it up by kind of showing how you have come out the other end kind of stronger, more capable, ready to take on college in the world.
That's good too, because the other essay our daughter wrote was about being rejected for a rowing team.
Oh, interesting.
Coach told her, "Come back when you find your inner bitch," which was a great first line in the essay, which then led her to pursue some other interests that she really excelled in. So that's similar to what you're just saying right now.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, and I'll go through the other archetypes in a second, but I would say, I mean, your daughter's first essay on the kind of manual versus automatic, that kind of falls into this other archetype, which we call the wild card essay, where it's kind of like not every student can really pull off a wild card essay, where like it's the quality of it is entirely in its execution.
Yes.
So another student could have tried to write the same essay and, it could have fallen on its face. Sorry. And so I would say like those essays are always incredibly fun to read when they're good, those kind of wild card essays. And I had my best friend in high school who ended up going to Harvard, wrote his essay about how he chooses his clothes in the morning. I would say I wrote much more of a kind of personal growth, traditional essay.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's mostly a question of the kind of person you are, and like what you think is going to be the best vehicle for your voice, and kind of what's distinctive about you. So
Let's
that
go.
wild card essay, if you are a very risk-taking person who has a really kind of distinctive viewpoint and kind of way of speaking about themselves, that might be the best direction.
Right. What are the other archetypes that you deal with? So there's two, now three more, right?
Yes. So then there's the kind of like critical analysis of a topic in the world essay. So I mean, I definitely see a lot of essays writing, especially about climate change, about various social justice issues, and I think, usually those will still have kind of a personal tie. I think that they are best when they do have a personal tie.
Sure.
But they can also kind of have a more, a kind of, they illustrate a sort of intellectual curiosity and
Right.
criticality that's a little bit distinctive from the sort of, here's my growth trajectory over the past 4 years essay. Third category would be the accomplishments essay, which it's a risky one because I think
That's a hard one because you don't want to come off as a bragging person thumping your chest.
precisely, yeah. And so it's you have to do it with humility and grace. I also think it's probably only worth doing if you have a kind of singular accomplishment that they're very unlikely to read about in other people's applications. Then that could be potentially a great essay. Fourth category would be the kind of passions, goals, aspirations essay, which is more future focused and kind of thinking. It's illustrating a sort of a clarity of vision and ambition for the future. So yeah, again, kind of gets the adcom excited about this next generation. But yeah, and then the fifth category being this kind of wild card, which is sort of the catch-all for the other types of essays. But I really do think it is kind of like the sort of thing where it when you see it, where it's like if another student had tried to pull off this essay, it really wouldn't have worked. But this person like absolutely nailed it.
Now, Rob, I wonder if you know whether people who are admitted to elite colleges know why they were admitted. Now, that may seem like a funny question because, of course, you get no feedback from the admissions office. And we know that in each of these schools, the applicant pool is highly competitive. I mean, you're really competing against the best of the best, and probably 80% of the people in the pool are qualified enough to get into these schools and to do well. And 20%, they probably don't have a clue and they're just sending an application. This is a generalization, of course. But the people who do get in, did they kind of know why they get in? Like when you got into Stanford, did you know why you got in? I have a sense for why our daughter got into Yale.
I'm curious to hear that.
Yeah.
You go.
She had a teacher in high school who was the advisor to the the high school newspaper, which he was editor-in-chief of, who basically wrote a recommendation that said, if I don't do a good job recommending this student to you, all the other teachers in the school will give me hell.
Wow, yeah.
And then went from there. And I really think that tipped her over. Sure, captain of the diving team, editor of the high school paper, valedictorian, high SAT score, sure. But that every box like that is ticked at a Yale, a Harvard, a Stanford, Princeton. There has to be just something else,
Yeah. I think that's true. And that's a great story. I would say so. Anecdotally, it's funny because when I was in undergrad, there they released, basically there was some sort of situation with, because of the amount of public funding Stanford took, you were legally allowed to see the responses to your application. Like you were allowed to basically audit your own application.
Oh,
So a
wow.
lot of students did go when I was maybe a sophomore or junior, and you got like 20 minutes in kind of a dark windowless room to like review all of the feedback on your application. I did not do that, because it seemed I wasn't that interested in doing
Right.
that. And yeah, I mean, I think I had some guesses. Like I think a kind of a similar story to your daughter, where like kind of checked all of the boxes from like a GPA, like SAT extracurricular perspective. And then like I went to kind of a very traditional Southern prep school in Atlanta, and I was like part of this team that basically created the first like gay straight alliance on campus, which had been this like massive drama in 2010 or whatever that was, where we had to, have all these meetings with the president of the high school, and it was it was
Yeah. So
different era. It was way more dramatic than it needed to be, but basically I had to kind of work through all of this kind of bureaucracy at pretty high levels of our school. And I think that story, which is what I wrote my Common App essay about, was was distinctive enough.
Yeah, and it showed your leadership potential, and it showed you at a time where you're under, I would imagine, a lot of adversity and pressure by powerful and older people.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Indeed. Which obviously is very admirable. And actually, I wanted to refine the story I told you. Not only did the teachers say that, what happened is when he was actually sitting down and writing her recommendation, another teacher walked in, saw what he was doing, and actually told him, "You better get that right, because if you don't, you're really going to screw this whole thing up." And he actually related that anecdote in the writing of the recommendation letter. Anyway,
that's the dream recommendation. That's what what we're all aiming for. So
obviously parents play a role in the application process for college candidates. And I'm wondering, how should a parent approach this if they have an unmotivated student versus a motivated student? And I imagine you would deal with this very differently. And this is a delicate and sensitive topic for sure, because we've all heard of the helicopter parent who's become the snowplow parent. And there's a difference between, forcing your child and doing the work for him or her, and making decisions that a student should be making, and guiding or navigating the path, and asking the right kinds of questions to help them get to the right place.
Yeah. So I would say maybe it's easier to begin with unmotivated. So I think that parent to an unmotivated child should be considering a few things. So first, asking kind of what sorts of resources do they already have in place. So if their school is providing a college counselor, if there are other kind of consultants or mentors kind of who are going to be playing a role, take that into account. I would say if they do not feel like they have those other resources, and the parent feels like they are the main resource that's going to kind of make sure that this plane gets landed, whatever metaphor you want to use, then I think it makes sense for them to take a pretty active role. And so first, working with their child, working with the student, that would be my kind of high level guideline. Above all, is making sure that instead of dictating, you are kind of working with them and coming up with deadlines that feel realistic to both parties. Anyway, so working with the student to come up with a kind of timeline for when they should be working on these college applications and finishing drafts of essays, when they intend to submit to various schools, as well as helping them however they can with this sort of high level strategy. So putting together that college list, deciding where to apply to early, finding the right balance of kind of reach, target, safety. I think it's great if a parent can kind of help bring together all these disparate elements so that the student can really focus on the execution of these essays, potentially studying for and improving their standardized test scores, continuing to do well in school, do all of their extracurriculars. It's an immense amount of things that they're having to do at once. I definitely do not think that they should help write the essay or kind of, in any way kind of overstep that boundary. I think it's very apparent, frankly, when I read an essay that a parent has tampered with. And if it's apparent to me, it's going to be apparent to admissions committees. So that would be the overstep. But I think all of the kind of, high level guidance, helping set deadlines, providing basically structure so that their child can then kind of execute on discrete pieces of work. Fantastic. I think for a motivated student, it becomes a different calculus. I mean, I think again, you have to kind of think about the individual student, what sorts of resources they have at their disposal. But often I think for those parents, just asking a couple of kind of clarifying questions about, of course, having their input about what sorts of schools their child should be applying to and any priorities they may have from a financial perspective. Any of that kind of high level context are always useful. But then letting their child kind of do their thing, I think is there's a lot of value in that. And I mean, I will say from my own experience, my parents were not involved at all in my application process. I jealously guarded my drafts of my essays and let them read a single word of any of my essays. And like they trusted me to do that because I had kind of proven that I would get it done throughout high school. So that would be kind of my thoughts there. Yeah.
And communication, I think, is really important here. I mean, just asking the right questions without any kind of feeling that you're attacking your child, gently guiding and asking the right questions that lead to all of the aspects of this. Like, do you think you could use a tutor or a class to do better on the standardized test? And if so, can we help you with that?
Yeah.
Or going over, as you point out, school selection, do you think you'd rather be in a large school, a small school, a rural environment, an urban environment? If you know what you really want to study, should you be applying to schools that are well known in that given discipline?
Sure.
I mean, things like that. And then, okay, if you're going to write an essay, maybe you didn't allow your parents to read your essays. Man, how about at the end? Didn't you show, hey, I'm sending this in?
I didn't, but I would say yes, most people should.
At the end, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it depends. Like I had college counselors in my school. I had English teachers I really trusted and admired who were helping me and like reading my drafts. So it's not as though no one else had read my drafts.
Sure.
But I think, yeah, like if I think parents should certainly offer to be that kind of sounding board and help to work on edits with their student. But I think, if they come back and say, I'm working with my English teacher on it, I'd really prefer if you didn't read it until, I have basically a final draft.
Right.
I think it would be great if parents respected that. Yeah.
How do you know that your child needs a mentor like a Rob Franklin and some help, or whether or not your child can do it on his or her own. Now, Rob, I'm thinking that you had existing resources at your prep school to help you, and you didn't need an admissions consultant. Am I right or am I wrong?
That's true. I mean, I think we interact differently with students kind of depending on what their circumstances are. So there are definitely students who have a ton of resources. And I think we serve a couple roles. I mean, I think first of all, we can kind of be the person who's putting together these sort of disparate elements, and helping them, set deadlines, do all of those things, because generally the in-school college consultants take a slightly more removed role. They have, often hundreds of students they're worrying about, thinking about. But I think our main function really is like thinking about what is going to be the most kind of compelling brand version of your story, and helping you kind of craft that and then run through several rounds of drafts, basically four rounds of drafts for every essay until, every comma is in the right place and it's super polished and it's kind of, it's the most compelling version of that story you could really tell. And that's for a student that already has a lot of resources. I think students who have no context on kind of how any of this works, we can also help kind of coach them from step one, about like what the kind of college application landscape looks like, what they should be prioritizing. So I do think there are myriad benefits kind of regardless of what your background is.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, and your essays don't have to read as if they were published in the New Yorker, right?
They don't. It helps probably. It certainly doesn't hurt. But yeah, I don't think it's I would say, I have had students who were clearly quite brilliant and had really impressive accomplishments who weren't natural writers. And their brilliance still kind of shines through, and it doesn't, it's not a huge issue that they don't have they don't have a kind of literary flair to their essay. And of course we can help with that. We can help them kind of unearth a sort of memorable voice, to inject into that essay and make it more personal. But I think, speaking kind of clearly and lucidly and having a very kind of clear message or takeaway about yourself is more significant.
Yeah, great advice. Last words, what would be your most important advice to give to a parent who's about to start the process with their child?
Oh, wow. I would say, my most important advice would be to really listen to your child, really listen to their listen to their particular challenges, listen to their goals for this process, and combine that with the sort of higher level knowledge that you have, the context that you have, and try to create a super personalized, tailored process for your child, rather than taking a kind of one size fits all approach.
Great advice. Rob, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Okay, so you've been listening to Rob Franklin, who is a mentor at Admissionado, the admissions consulting firm. Rob, obviously, as I pointed out earlier, is a Stanford graduate. He just received his master's in fine arts from NYU. He is a creative writer. He's working on a novel right now. You probably don't want to tell us what it's about.
Not today.
I know, but we'll look forward to it, and we'll cheer you on from afar. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
For all of you out there, thank you for watching. This is John Byrne with Poets and Quants.
Bye.